The gunshots still echo in that narrow alley, though the smoke cleared more than a century ago. October 26, 1881, Tombstone, Arizona, a dusty backlot barely wider than a modern parking space. 3 men lie dead or dying in the alkali dirt. 3 more bleed from fresh wounds, and in those 30 seconds of chaos, a legend is born, not from heroism, but from the desperate flailing of men who'd backed themselves into a corner they'd spent months building. This is not the story you've been told, not the noble tale of brave lawmen standing against chaos. This is the story of a man who genuinely wanted to build something lasting, something respectable, something that would outlive the violence of the frontier. But Wyatt Earp could only build his empire with the tools he knew best: intimidation, corruption, and when those failed, the Colt 45 on his hip. If you appreciate history with the propaganda peeled off and the ugly truth exposed, consider subscribing. Drop a comment about where you're listening from. I'm curious who else enjoys their history served black, without the sugar coating of Hollywood westerns. Tonight, let me tell you about a different kind of American tragedy. Not the tragedy of good versus evil, but of a man caught between the respectable future he desperately craved and the bloody methods that were the only currency he understood. Wyatt Earp came to Tombstone as an entrepreneur, a capitalist with grand ambitions. He left it as a killer, his dreams as dead as the men in that alley, forever trapped in a legend he never wanted but couldn't escape. So settle back. Let the desert wind carry you to a town that sat on a fortune in silver and a powder keg of resentment. A town where the line between law and lawless wasn't just blurry. It was drawn fresh each morning by whoever had the most guns and the will to use them. Welcome to Tombstone, where fortunes were made, empires were dreamed, and futures died in the time it takes to empty a revolver. The morning Wyatt Earp first saw Tombstone, the December sun cast long shadows across the San Pedro Valley, and the smell of money hung in the air thicker than the dust from the silver mines. It was 1879, and the town sprawled across the desert like a fever dream made real, where 2 years before there had been nothing but Apache territory and scrub brush. Now stood a metropolis of 10,000 souls, all drawn by the promise of fortune bleeding from the earth in streams of silver ore. The sound never stopped. The rhythmic pounding of the stamp mills crushing rock into wealth, the creak of freight wagons hauling supplies, the tinny music spilling from dozens of saloons that never closed. Wyatt didn't come for the silver in the ground, he came for the silver in men's pockets. At 31, he stood 6 feet tall, lean as a fence post, with the kind of pale blue eyes that could count money or measure a grave with equal dispassion. His moustache, waxed to point sharp enough to draw blood, was his one vanity. Everything else about him was business. He tried his hand at law enforcement in Kansas, but a badge paid $30 a month. He'd hunted buffalo until the herds thinned out. He'd run faro games in cow towns until the cattle drives dried up. Now he looked at Tombstone and saw his last, best chance at the American dream. Not digging wealth from the ground, but harvesting it from those who did. His plan was elegant in its simplicity. While others broke their backs in the mines, he would provide what every boomtown needed: order for those who could afford it, vice for those who couldn't resist it, and protection for both. He'd brought his brothers, Virgil, Morgan, and James, because blood was the only trust that held firm on the frontier. Together, they would build an empire of respectability on foundations of carefully managed violence. But Tombstone was already divided when the Earps arrived, split like a card deck cut for a game where everyone was cheating. On one side sat the Republicans, the mine owners and merchants who'd fled the played-out goldfields of California to stake new claims in Arizona. Men like Mayor John Clum, who ran the Tombstone Epitaph newspaper and preached progress from its pages. They called themselves the Law and Order faction. though what they really meant was law and order that protected their interests, their property, their vision of Tombstone as the next San Francisco. Across the invisible line stood the Democrats, the Cowboys, though that name was a genteel lie for what they really were. Ranchers, yes, but also rustlers who built their herds with cattle stolen from Mexico, former Confederates who'd never accepted defeat, who saw federal law as continued occupation, men like the Clanton family and the McClory brothers, who'd carved out their own rough kingdom in the San Pedro Valley and weren't about to let some Kansas lawmen tell them how to live. Between these factions, Tombstone simmered like a pot about to boil over. Every saloon was a neutral zone where enemies drank side by side, hands never far from their guns. Every business deal was a chess move in a larger game. Every badge was a declaration of allegiance. Wyatt made his choice with the calculated precision of a faro dealer palming cards. The Oriental Saloon stood on the corner of Allen and 5th Streets, the crown jewel of Tombstone's gambling halls. Its cut-glass chandeliers and Brussels carpets spoke of civilization, of the future Tombstone could become. The first time Wyatt walked through its doors, the sensory assault nearly staggered him. The air hung thick as wool blankets, layered with cigar smoke, Kentucky bourbon, and the peculiar musk of men who'd spent too long between baths. Beneath it all lurked the sharp tang of silver, not the ore, but the coins that clicked and whispered across the green felt tables like metal rain. The piano in the corner played something that might have been Mozart before the desert heat warped the strings, each note hanging in the air a beat too long. He stood at the faro table, watching the dealer's hands move with mechanical grace. The cards whispered secrets as they slid from the box, each one a promise or a threat. The ivory chips clicked like bones. Players leaned forward, their eyes glassy with concentration and whiskey, their collar stains dark with sweat despite the December chill outside. This was where real money moved, where a single turn of a card could transfer a month's wages or a year's savings. The owner, a thin man named Rickabor who smelled of bay rum and anxiety, made his offer in the back office. A quarter interest in the gambling concession in exchange for keeping the peace. Not with a badge, that was for show. With presence, with reputation, with the willingness to grab a troublemaker by the collar and introduce his face to Allen Street at velocity. Wyatt accepted by dealing his first hand that very night. The cards felt right in his fingers, smooth as silk, dangerous as daggers. Let other men dig for silver in the dark, choking earth. He would mine it from the gaming tables, one hand at a time. But the deal came with chains heavier than any badge. By taking that position, Wyatt had chosen a side. He was now the enforcer for the Republican vision of Tombstone, the hired gun for progress. Every drunk cowboy he threw out, every rustler he faced down, every Mexican he barred from the tables. It all added another link to the chain of resentment that would eventually drag everyone down. Into this powder keg walked a man who was himself a walking catastrophe. John Henry Holliday, doc to those who dared use the familiar, arrived in Tombstone like a plague wind, bringing with him the scent of death that had nothing to do with the consumption rotting his lungs. He took rooms at Fly's boarding house, a 12-room establishment that catered to those who paid in advance because they might not live to pay later. His quarters were spare as a monk's cell, a narrow bed with iron rails, a washstand where blood-stained handkerchiefs soaked in water that turned pink then red, a small table where he kept his dental tools in a leather case that he opened less and less as his hands shook more and more. The coughing came at night, mostly. Great racking spasms that shook the thin walls and woke the other boarders. They'd hear him stumbling to the washstand, the splash of water, the wet sounds that followed. In the morning, the maid would find the handkerchiefs, stiff with dried blood, and burn them in the alley. The smell of burning cotton and copper would drift back through his window, a preview of hell. He was everything the frontier despised and feared, a southern aristocrat with soft hands that could still deal seconds faster than most men could blink, a classical education that he wore like armour against the world's crudeness, a dentist who traded his practice for a poker deck when too many patients fled from his bloody cough. The tuberculosis that was killing him by degrees had burned away everything non-essential, leaving only a brilliant, vicious core wrapped in the exquisite manners of a lost world. His first encounter with the Cowboys came at the Oriental, where he'd set up shop at the faro table. They swaggered in smelling of horse sweat and Mexican dust, their spurs ringing on the floor like dropped coins. When they heard his Georgia drawl, saw his pale hands unmarked by honest work, watched him sip whiskey like it was brandy in a drawing room, their contempt was immediate and absolute. One of them, a thick-necked brute whose name didn't matter, made a comment about southern gentlemen who couldn't tell a cow from a cotillion. Doc's response was to quote Cicero in perfect Latin while dealing the cards, never missing a beat, his grey eyes flat as tombstones. When the cowboy reached for his gun, Doc's hand was already there, his nickel-plated pistol appearing like a magic trick. The room held its breath. Then Doc smiled, that terrible smile that showed too many teeth and no warmth at all, and suggested the gentleman might find better entertainment elsewhere. The Cowboys left, but the insult festered. Doc Holliday had marked himself as their enemy not through action but through existence, a dying aristocrat who refused to know his place. The first crack in the dam came in March of 1881, when the Benson stage was robbed. 2 men died in the hold-up, and when the Earps tracked the crime back toward the Cowboy faction, it became personal. Not because of the dead men, death was common currency in Tombstone, but because the stage carried a Wells Fargo shipment, and Wells Fargo paid well for protection. More than that, it was a direct challenge to the order Wyatt was hired to maintain. Wyatt tried to play both sides, secretly offering the Cowboys a deal to turn in the robbers. But secrets in Tombstone had a way of growing legs and walking into the wrong saloons. When word leaked that Wyatt had been negotiating with the very men he was supposed to arrest, it added another grievance to a list already written in blood. By the summer of 1881, Tombstone wasn't a town anymore. It was a vast gambling hall where everyone was all in, where the pot had grown too large for anyone to fold, where someone was going to have to call or draw. The smart money was already heading for the exits, taking the stage to Tucson or Benson, anywhere but this pressure cooker in the desert. Wyatt stood at the faro table in the Oriental, dealing cards with the mechanical precision of a man who'd found his place in the world. He'd invested everything in Tombstone: money, reputation, family. His dream of respectability was so close he could taste it like metal on his tongue. Just a little more time, a little more order, a little more force properly applied, and Tombstone would become what he envisioned. A real city where a man could build something permanent, something that would outlast the silver and the violence. He couldn't see what everyone else could, that he'd already built his empire, not of brick and respectability, but of fear and resentment. Every enforcement of his version of the order created more chaos. Every alliance deepened the divisions. Every victory brought the final reckoning closer. In the shadows of the San Pedro Valley, the Cowboys nursed their grievances like whiskey, each slight fermenting into something stronger and more poisonous. In the saloons of Tombstone, Doc Holliday coughed blood into his handkerchief and smiled at death like an old friend he was eager to introduce to others, and at his faro table, Wyatt Earp dealt cards and calculated odds, never realising he'd already drawn the dead man's hand. The fuse was lit. All that remained was to see how long it would burn before Tombstone exploded, and whether anyone would survive the blast. The house always wins in the end, but in Tombstone, everyone was playing against the house, and the house was armed. The night of October 25th, 1881, Tombstone saloons glowed like furnaces in the darkness, and inside one of them, A terrified man was talking himself to death. The Alhambra saloon reeked of stale beer and fresh fear. Sawdust on the floor had turned to mud from spilled drinks and tobacco juice, squelching under Ike Clanton's boots as he weaved between tables. The whiskey burned his throat like liquid fire, each shot chasing the last, trying to drown the voice in his head that kept whispering he was already dead. The mirror behind the bar reflected a dozen Ike Clantons, each one uglier than the last. His eyes were red-rimmed, darting like a spooked horse. Sweat ran down his face despite the October chill, cutting channels through the dust on his cheeks. His hands shook when he lifted the glass, whiskey slopping over the rim, and he could taste his own fear under the alcohol, metallic, like blood, like the end of things. He moved from saloon to saloon like a prophet of his own doom, his words slurring but his message clear. Tomorrow, someone would die. In the Grand Hotel's bar, under the yellow glow of coal oil lamps that made everyone look jaundiced, he cornered anyone who'd listen. The other drinkers edged away, not wanting to be splattered when the blood started flowing. To understand Ike's desperate performance that night, you had to understand what drove him to it. He wasn't simply a loudmouth drunk spoiling for a fight. He was a man watching his world disappear one ordinance at a time. Every swallow of whiskey tasted like another freedom lost. The weight of his pistol on his hip was the only comfort left, the only argument that still mattered. The Occidental was where he found his courage, or what passed for it. The bartender, a German named Wagner who'd seen enough drunk cowboys to fill a cemetery, kept pouring as long as Ike kept paying. The whiskey was the cheap stuff, more grain alcohol than bourbon, and it hit Ike's empty stomach like a fist. He hadn't eaten since yesterday. Couldn't remember when food had stopped mattering. Between drinks, he'd step outside to vomit in the alley, the cold air hitting his fevered face like a slap. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent as buzzards. He'd lean against the rough adobe wall, feeling the grit under his palms, tasting bile and whiskey and the certainty that by tomorrow night he'd either be a hero or a corpse. But the Earps and their Republican friends wanted a different Tombstone. They wanted Eastern investors and proper banks and wives who could walk the streets without seeing armed men at every corner. They wanted the Cowboys gone, or tamed, or buried. They weren't particular about which. Every city ordinance that banned firearms within town limits was another fence around the Cowboys' freedom. Every arrest for drunk and disorderly was another reminder that their time was ending. Ike could feel the walls closing in, and like any trapped animal, he was ready to bite. The whiskey told him he was brave. The fear told him he was dead already. The combination produced a night-long performance that would have been comic if it wasn't so tragic. He found Doc Holliday in the Alhambra saloon, dealing faro with hands steady despite the blood specks on his handkerchief. Ike's challenge came out garbled but clear enough. Something about Holliday's consumptive carcass and what Ike would do to it come morning. Doc's response was elegant in its simplicity. He was always ready for a fight, he indicated, and Ike could find him whenever his courage caught up to his mouth. When Virgil Earp arrived to break it up, Ike transferred his rage to a bigger target. All night he ranged through Tombstone Saloon District, promising death to any Earp who showed his face, swearing vengeance for 1,000 real and imagined slights. He was performing for an audience, his fellow cowboys, the townspeople, maybe even himself. See how brave Ike Clanton was? See how he stood up to the Earp machine? By dawn, Ike had talked so much his throat was raw, made so many threats his hand shook when he reached for his gun. He'd painted himself into a corner with words, and now the sun was rising on a day when words wouldn't be enough. The morning of October 26th broke cold and clear, the kind of desert morning where sounds carry for miles and the air tastes like iron. Ike was still armed, still making threats, but now in the harsh light of day, his bravado looked exactly like what it was. The desperate flailing of a man who'd written checks with his mouth that his gun hand couldn't cash. When Virgil and Morgan Earp found him around noon, still carrying his Winchester and revolver, the confrontation was brief and brutal. They buffaloed him, a frontier term for pistol whipping, and dragged him before Judge Wallace for carrying weapons within city limits, even in court, with a split scalp dripping blood. Ike couldn't stop talking. He snarled challenges at Wyatt, promised death to anyone wearing an Earp name, swore his friends would finish what he started. His friends. That was the real tragedy brewing. Tom and Frank McClory had come to town on business, not looking for trouble. Billy Clanton, just 19 years old, had ridden in to buy supplies. They were cowboys, yes, but they hadn't spent the night making threats. They were about to pay for Ike's performance with their lives. The afternoon turned strange, time stretching like taffy in the desert heat. The Earps and the Cowboys moved through Tombstone like pieces on a chessboard, always aware of each other, never quite meeting. Witnesses would later disagree on every detail: who was armed, who made threats, who wanted peace, and who wanted war. The truth got lost in the dust, leaving only positions and possibilities. By 2:30, the Cowboys had gathered near the OK Corral, though not in it. That was another lie history would tell. They stood in a narrow vacant lot on Fremont Street, 15 feet wide, backed against a board fence like actors on a stage too small for the drama about to unfold. 5 men crowded into a space barely big enough for 2 wagons to pass. Their horses stood patient in the afternoon sun, not knowing they were about to run riderless. Sheriff John Behan, political enemy of the Earps and friend to the Cowboys, tried to play peacemaker. He'd patted down Ike Clanton, confirmed he was unarmed. The great irony of the day. The man who'd started it all with his threats would be the only one to walk away unscathed. Behan asked the others to give up their guns. They refused, or hesitated, or agreed. Witnesses could never keep their stories straight. Then came the footsteps, boot heels on wooden sidewalk, measured and deliberate. The Earp brothers, Virgil, Wyatt, and Morgan, walking line abreast down Fremont Street. With them came Doc Holliday, pale as paper, carrying a shotgun under his grey overcoat. They walked like men going to work, which in a sense they were. Virgil, as town marshal, had decided to enforce the weapons ordinance. His brothers were his deputies. This was city business, but everyone knew better. This was personal business dressed in a badge's authority. Sheriff Behan met them halfway, tried to stop them. He disarmed the Cowboys, he claimed, though the lie was transparent as glass. Virgil brushed past him. There was no stopping what had been building since Wyatt first took his percentage at the Oriental, since the Benson stage was robbed, since Ike Clanton started drinking liquid courage 12 hours before. The two groups faced each other across 20 feet of dirt. The Earps spread out, professional as always. Doc took the left flank, his shotgun hidden but ready. The Cowboys stood backed against the fence. Tom McClory, possibly unarmed, possibly with a pistol hidden in his waistband. Billy Clanton, the youngest, his hand nervous near his gun. Frank McClory, steady, dangerous, ready. And Ike Clanton, who'd started it all, standing unarmed and suddenly very sober. Virgil Earp raised his right hand, his cane in it. He'd later claim he was showing he came in peace. His words carried across the lot some version of a demand for surrender, for weapons, for compliance with city law. The exact phrase was lost in what came next. Someone moved. Maybe it was Tom McClory reaching for a rifle on his horse. Maybe it was Doc Holliday shifting his shotgun. Maybe it was Billy Clanton, 19 years old and scared, his hand twitching toward his pistol. History would never know, because in that narrow lot, with 7 armed men facing each other at conversation distance, any movement was a declaration of war. The first shots cracked the afternoon air like a whip. Then came the thunder. The sound was different than people expected. Each gun spoke with its own voice. The sharp bark of Wyatt's Colt 45, the deeper boom of Doc's shotgun, the higher crack of Billy Clanton's 44. They overlapped and echoed off the buildings, creating a wall of sound that seemed to go on forever but lasted only seconds. The black powder smoke billowed out instantly, thick as London fog, acrid enough to burn the throat. It stank of sulphur and saltpetre, the devil's own perfume. Within 3 seconds, the narrow lot was so choked with smoke that men were firing at shadows, at movement, at the muzzle flashes that bloomed like deadly flowers in the grey haze. Billy Clanton's first shot went wild, ploughing into the dirt at Wyatt's feet, sending up a spray of alkali dust that mixed with the gun smoke. The boy was trying to draw and fire while backing up, his boots slipping on the loose ground. Frank McClory had better luck, his shot catching Virgil in the calf, the sound of lead hitting flesh like a wet slap. Doc's shotgun spoke twice, rapid as a cough. The first blast caught Tom McClory as he reached for a rifle on his horse. The buckshot spread at that range was tight as a fist, punching through his right side below the armpit. The sound he made wasn't a scream, more like all the air leaving a bellows. The second blast went somewhere into the smoke, splinters erupting from the board fence. Morgan Earp was firing fast, too fast, his shots climbing with each pull of the trigger. One caught Billy Clanton in the wrist, sending his pistol spinning. The boy switched hands, kept shooting left-handed, his face set in a grimace of concentration that made him look older than his 19 years. Wyatt moved through it all like a man in a dream, untouched, unhurried. His shots were measured, deliberate, one for Frank McClory's head, just below the ear. The sound of skull breaking was audible even over the gunfire, like a gourd dropped on stone. Frank's head snapped sideways, and he fell in a heap, his boot still caught in his horse's stirrup, dragging him a few feet before the animal broke free. The horses were screaming. People always forgot that detail. High, almost human shrieks as they fought their reins, eyes rolling white, foam flying from their mouths. One reared and came down hard, its hooves missing Doc by inches, adding dust to the smoke until the very air seemed solid. 30 seconds. That's all it took. 30 seconds that seemed to stretch into hours, where every detail was carved into memory with acid. The taste of gunpowder, bitter as medicine. The way the smoke made everyone's eyes stream tears. The sound of Billy Clanton trying to reload with a shattered wrist. Cartridges spilling from his fingers like golden rain. When the smoke cleared, the butcher's bill was terrible. Billy Clanton gut shot, trying to reload with failing fingers. Frank McClory, a bullet through his head, dead before he hit the ground. Tom McClory, torn nearly in half by Doc's shotgun, his last breath bubbling through the holes in his chest. On the other side, Virgil Earp with a bullet through his calf. Morgan Earp, shot across the shoulders. Doc Holliday, grazed by a bullet that left a red line across his hip. Wyatt Earp, alone among the combatants, untouched by lead, standing in the centre of the lot like death's own angel. And Ike Clanton, the man whose drunken threats had started it all? He ran, grabbed Wyatt's arm, begged for his life, claimed he was unarmed, which for once was true. Wyatt shoved him aside with contempt. The fight had commenced, he told him. Go to fighting or get away. Ike chose to get away. He ran through Fly's photography studio, across another lot, through a saloon, and didn't stop until he was blocks away, leaving his younger brother Billy to die in the dirt for threats Ike had made. The echoes faded. The smoke drifted away on the desert wind. 3 men lay dead or dying in a lot barely big enough to turn a wagon. The Earps and Holliday walked away, Virgil and Morgan leaning on their brothers, Doc reloading his shotgun with mechanical precision. Behind them, Tombstone held its breath. Everyone knew this wasn't over. The 30-second war had ended, but the real war was just beginning. In the narrow lot, blood soaked into alkali soil that would never wash clean. The sun continued its arc across the Arizona sky, indifferent to human drama, and somewhere in Tombstone, Ike Clanton hid and shook and began planning his revenge, never understanding that he'd already killed everyone who mattered, including himself. Justice, Wyatt Earp would learn, was just another game where the house edge depended on who was dealing. The gunfight smoke had barely cleared when Tombstone split into armed camps in the Epitaph office. Mayor John Clum was already setting type for an editorial that would proclaim the killings justified, a necessary cancer surgery on the body politic. Across town at the Nugget, other fingers arranged different letters to spell murder, assassination, cold blood. But the real verdict would come in Judge Wells Spicer's courtroom, and for 30 days, the war for Tombstone's soul moved from the streets to the witness stand. The hearing should have been simple, a preliminary examination to determine if the Earps and Holliday should stand trial for murder. Instead, it became Tombstone's last attempt to settle its differences through law rather than lead. Both sides hired the best legal talent money could buy. Witnesses were coached, threatened, bribed. The truth became as malleable as warm wax, shaped by whoever held it last. Ike Clanton took the stand and spun a tale that would have been magnificent if anyone believed it. In his version, the Earps were the secret masterminds behind the Benson stage robbery, and they'd killed the Cowboys to silence them. He painted himself as an innocent victim, unarmed and pleading for peace. The problem was Ike had cried wolf so many times that even his truth sounded like lies. Sheriff Bien testified with more skill, portraying the Cowboys as attempting to surrender when the Earps opened fire. For a moment, it looked like his version might stick. Judge Spicer revoked bail for Wyatt and Doc, sending them to the county jail. For 16 days, they sat in cells, listening to the mob outside debate whether to wait for hanging or handle justice themselves. But the defense had an ace to play. Wyatt's lawyer, Tom Fitch, invoked an obscure territorial statute that allowed a defendant to make a statement without cross-examination. Wyatt took the stand and told his story with the calm precision of a man dealing faro. Every action justified, every shot necessary, every death regrettable but legal. The strategy worked. On November 29th, Judge Spicer delivered his verdict. While criticising Virgil for deputising Doc Holliday, he found the defendants had acted within their authority as lawmen. The key point, Spicer noted with surgical precision, was that Ike Clanton, the instigator, was the only one who walked away unharmed. If the Earps had gone there to murder, why spare the man who'd threatened them most? The Cowboys received the verdict like a declaration of war. In the saloons and ranch houses of the San Pedro Valley, men cleaned their guns and made plans. The law had failed them. They would write their own verdict in gunpowder and blood. 2 months passed in pregnant silence. Then, on the night of December 28th, Virgil Earp walked across Allen Street, his marshal's badge catching the light from the saloon windows. He was thinking about his wife Allie, about the late dinner waiting, about anything but the men waiting in the shadows of the unfinished building. The shotgun blast came from the darkness, tearing through the night and Virgil's left arm. Lead pellets shredded muscle and shattered bone. He spun and fell, his revolver clattering across the boardwalk. More shots followed, but Virgil was already down, already crawling toward cover, his blood painting a trail across the dusty street. They saved his life but couldn't save his arm. The surgeons wanted to amputate, but Virgil refused. He would keep the arm, useless as it was, a permanent reminder of the price of wearing a badge in Tombstone. He would never deal faro again, never draw a gun with smooth precision. The Cowboys had crippled more than his body. They destroyed his livelihood. Wyatt's response was cold fury compressed into diamond hardness. He knew who'd done it. Everyone knew. But knowing and proving were different games, and the law was a broken tool in Tombstone. Witnesses developed amnesia. Alibis appeared like mushrooms after rain. Ike Clanton was arrested and released, his smile saying what his mouth didn't dare. Through the winter, Wyatt waited and planned. He was done with the fiction of building a respectable empire. Tombstone had shown him what his dreams were worth, exactly as much as the lead it took to defend them. But he still had family to protect, still had debts to pay. The payment came due on March 18th, a Saturday night like any other, the saloons full, the faro games running, the mines grinding out wealth around the clock. Morgan Earp was playing billiards at Campbell and Hatch's, relaxing for the first time in months. The billiard hall was warm with body heat and coal oil lamps, thick with the blue haze of good cigars. It smelled of chalk dust and beer, of leather and wool and the peculiar musk of men at leisure. The click of ivory balls carried a rhythm like a heartbeat, punctuated by laughter and the clink of glasses. Morgan was lining up a bank shot, the cue sliding through his fingers smooth as water. He'd always been the best player among the brothers, his hand steady, his eye true. The green felt stretched before him like a miniature prairie, the balls scattered like tiny wagons to be guided home. He chalked his cue with practiced motions, the blue dust falling like snow. Wyatt sat nearby, half watching the game, half watching the room. It was an old habit, picking a seat where he could see all the entrances. But tonight he was tired, his attention wandering. The sound of the balls was hypnotic. The warmth made him drowsy. For just a moment, he let his guard down. The door to the alley had 2 glass panes, painted over but thin as paper. When they exploded inward, the sound was oddly delicate, like wind chimes made of ice. Then came the boom of the rifle, so loud in the enclosed space that men would find their ears ringing for days after. The bullet caught Morgan low in the spine, travelled through his body, and lodged in the thigh of George Berry, who'd been watching the game. Morgan's cue stick clattered on the floor, rolling until it bumped against a spittoon. He fell forward onto the table, his weight breaking the delicate geometry of the game. Balls scattering in all directions. They carried him to a lounge nearby, Bob Hatch's office behind the billiard hall. The couch was too short for Morgan's frame, his boots hanging over the arm. Wyatt held his brother's hand while Dr. Matthews worked. Though there was nothing to be done, the wound was mortal, the bleeding internal and unstoppable. Morgan tried to speak, blood bubbling from his lips with each word, something about the game, about the shot he'd been lining up. He seemed confused, trying to sit up, to get back to the table. Wyatt pressed him down gently, felt the fever already starting in his brother's skin. The last thing Morgan said was about their mother, something from their childhood that Wyatt couldn't quite catch. Then his breathing changed, became shallow, stopped. Wyatt sat holding his dead brother's hand while outside. Tombstone went on with its Saturday night as if nothing had changed. The room smelled of gunpowder and blood, of chalk dust and spilled whiskey. Someone had knocked over a glass in the chaos, and it dripped steadily onto the floor, marking time. Wyatt could hear the billiard games resuming in the main hall, the click of balls like a mockery of heartbeats. But everything had changed. The entrepreneur was dead. The lawman was dead. What remained was something older, simpler, more honest. A killer with accounts to settle. The transformation was marked by a single act. Wyatt sought out U.S. Marshal Crawley Dake, who commissioned him as a deputy federal marshal. The badge meant nothing to Wyatt except legal cover for what he planned. He assembled his posse, Brother Warren, Doc Holliday despite his worsening consumption, and a handful of hard men who understood the work ahead. The first to die was Frank Stillwell, caught at the Tucson train depot where he'd gone to finish the job on Virgil, who was being evacuated to California. Wyatt's posse ran him down in the train yard. The coroner would count 5 different calibers of bullets in Stillwell's body. He'd been shot at close range, so close that powder burns tattooed his skin. It wasn't an arrest, it was an execution. Within hours, Wyatt the federal marshal was also Wyatt the fugitive. Tucson's sheriff wired murder warrants to Sheriff Bean, who formed his own posse to hunt the hunters. The absurdity was complete. Two official posse, both claiming legal authority, stalking each other across the Arizona desert. The Vendetta ride continued with mechanical precision. Florentino Cruz, another suspect in Morgan's murder, was found and killed. Pete Spence's wood camp was hit. When Spence wasn't there, they killed Indian Charlie instead. Each death was a message written in blood. You can run, but you can't run far enough. The strangest encounter came at Iron Springs, where Wyatt's posse met a group of cowboys led by Curly Bill Brocious. In the ensuing firefight, Wyatt walked into the open, shotgun in hand, bullets cutting the air around him like invisible wasps. He emptied both barrels into Curly Bill, nearly cutting him in half, then walked back to cover untouched. His men would later swear it was like watching a man charmed against lead, but charmed or not. Wyatt knew the game was over. He'd had his vengeance, but the cost was everything he'd built in Tombstone. His investments were worthless. His reputation was destroyed. He was wanted for murder in the territory he'd tried to civilize. In May 1882, Wyatt Earp and his remaining followers rode out of Arizona for the last time. Behind them, Tombstone began its slow slide from boom to bust, the silver playing out, the population drifting away. The epitaph and the nugget would argue for years about who was right, but it didn't matter. Everyone had lost. Wyatt would live another 47 years, drifting from boomtown to boomtown, always trying to recapture that Tombstone dream, always failing. He ran saloons and gambling halls, invested in mines and real estate, told his story to anyone who would listen. But he never again tried to build an empire. He'd learned the price of that ambition in a narrow lot on Fremont Street. The Vendetta had balanced the books in blood, but the ledger would never close. Every man who died took with him a piece of the future Wyatt had imagined, until all that remained was the past, endlessly retold, endlessly reshaped, as distant from the truth as Tombstone was from the respectable city it had dreamed of becoming. The curious thing about shadows is how they grow longer as the sun sets, stretching far beyond the body that cast them. By the time Wyatt Earp died in Los Angeles in 1929, he had lived long enough to see himself transformed from killer to hero, from the man who destroyed Tombstone's peace to the man who brought law to the lawless West. The movies had already started telling a story, each version a little cleaner, a little nobler, until the man on the screen bore no resemblance to the man who dealt faro at the Oriental Saloon. He spent his last years in a small apartment, living on his wife's income and the occasional payment from Hollywood producers who wanted to hear the real story. He would tell them what they wanted to hear, tales of brave lawmen and black-hatted villains, of justice served at high noon. The truth was more valuable than money to him by then, locked away where it couldn't hurt anymore. The truth was simpler and sadder than any movie. Wyatt Earp had gone to Tombstone with a genuine dream of building something permanent, something respectable, something that would outlast the cycle of boom and bust that defined the frontier. He wanted to be a businessman, not a gunman, an empire builder, not an angel of death. But he could only build with the tools he knew: intimidation, violence, and the careful application of fear. Every step toward his dream of order required another step into disorder. Every alliance created an enemy. Every enforcement of his vision of law created another outlaw. He was like a man trying to climb out of a hole by digging deeper. The gunfight at the OK Corral. That name that never was. That location that wasn't right. That heroic stand that was really a squalid street assassination. Became the moment when the whole collapsed. 30 seconds that destroyed years of careful building. 3 dead men who took with them any chance of the future Wyatt had imagined. The vendetta that followed was just the epilogue, written in blood across the Arizona desert. By the time Wyatt rode out of the territory, he'd become exactly what his enemies had always said he was: a killer with a badge, using the law as cover for murder. The bitter irony was that in trying to build a legacy of law and order, he'd created a legend of violence that would outlive any city he might have built. Tombstone itself died slowly, the silver playing out, the population drifting away like smoke on the desert wind. Today it exists as a tourist attraction, a theme park of the Old West where actors stage gunfights for crowds eating ice cream. The Oriental Saloon serves souvenirs instead of whiskey. The narrow lot where 3 men died is marked with a plaque that gets the location wrong. But the real monument to that day isn't in Tombstone. It's in every Western movie, every pulp novel, every tale of good guys and bad guys settling their differences with 6 guns. The myth that Wyatt Earp never wanted but couldn't escape, growing larger with each telling, casting a shadow that swallowed the man himself. In the end, Wyatt Earp's tragedy wasn't that he failed to bring law to Tombstone, it was that he succeeded too well in creating his own legend. A legend that turned a complex man struggling with impossible circumstances into a simple symbol, a shadow puppet dancing on the wall of American mythology. He'd wanted to build something that would last. He succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. It just wasn't what he'd planned to build. Rest now, in the quiet aftermath of a war that nobody won. Think of shadows growing long across the desert, of dreams that become nightmares, of men who build their own prisons bar by bar. Think of Tombstone, where the only thing that proved permanent was the impermanence of everything, except the stories we tell ourselves to make sense of the violence. The house always wins, even when the house burns down, and in the morning. The desert looks the same as it did before men came with their dreams and their guns, as it will look long after the last tourist has taken the last photograph of the last fake gunfight in the last theme park of the Old West. Sleep comes to Tombstone now, as it came to Wyatt Earp at last, not as surrender, but as the final understanding that some wars end not in victory or defeat, but in the quiet recognition that they should never have been fought at all.